The Libyan Desert stretched endless under the 1942 sun, a furnace of sand and stone that devoured ambition as easily as it swallowed tracks. American GIs, fresh from stateside training camps, leaned against their Willys jeeps, wiping sweat from their brows. Their vehicles were the pride of Allied engineering, rugged, powerful, a roaring symbol of industrial might. Each Jeep's 60-horsepower engine thrummed with confidence, its wide tires chewing through terrain with the arrogance of a machine built to win a war. The men trusted their Jeeps like they trusted their rifles. This is how we'll beat the Nazis, they thought, grinning through the dust caked on their faces. With horsepower and heart. Then they saw it. It crawled over a dune like an insect scuttling across a tabletop, a boxy, awkward shape that seemed to defy the very idea of a military vehicle. The German Kübelwagen. Its slab-sided body looked cobbled together from spare parts, its narrow tires barely gripping the sand. No growling V8, no heavy armor, just a puttering air-cooled engine that sounded like a lawnmower struggling to start. The Americans squinted, then burst into laughter. "What the hell is that thing?" Private Tommy Callahan barked, slapping the hood of his Jeep. "Looks like a damn bathtub with wheels." "That's their secret weapon?" Another GI, Sergeant Mike Reynolds, chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "My kid's toy truck's got more guts than that." The Kübelwagen sat there, captured in a skirmish near El Agheila, its matte desert paint chipped and scarred. It was a Type 82, the Wehrmacht's utility vehicle, born from the civilian Volkswagen Beetle. To the Americans, it was a joke. At 20s and 200 pounds, it was half the weight of a Jeep. Its 24-horsepower engine was a fraction of the power. No radiator, no four-wheel drive, no swagger. Just a steel bucket with a motor tacked on. The men circled it, kicking its tires, peering into its Spartan interior. A canvas roof flapped uselessly in the wind. "This thing's gonna fall apart by lunch," Callahan thought. The British troops nearby, part of the 8th Army, joined the mockery. "Bloody Germans," a Cockney corporal spat, couldn't even afford proper wheels for their tin can. They'd seen their own Bedford trucks and American Jeeps dominate the desert's supply lines. The Kübelwagen, they figured, was a sign of German desperation, a cheap knockoff from a nation running out of steel and ideas. But Hans Becker, a wiry Afrika Korps mechanic, watched from a distance, his hands bound behind him as a prisoner. His sunburned face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes followed the Kübelwagen with a quiet pride. "They laugh now," he thought. "They won't laugh when the sand starts swallowing their precious Jeeps." Becker had driven that vehicle across 300 miles of desert, through wadis and dunes, without a single breakdown. He knew what it could do. He'd seen it save lives, carry orders, and outrun the odds. The Americans didn't know. Not yet. The story of the Kübelwagen begins not in the desert, but in the mind of a man who saw beauty in simplicity. Ferdinand Porsche. In 1938, with Germany rearming and the Volkswagen Beetle still a civilian dream, Porsche was tasked with creating a military vehicle that could match the nation's blitzkrieg ambitions. The Wehrmacht demanded something light, cheap, and reliable, something that could be mass-produced on a shoestring budget. Porsche, a perfectionist who designed tanks and race cars, turned to his Beetle. Strip it down, he thought. Make it lean. Make it enough. The result was the Type 82 Kübelwagen, literally bucket car. Its flat-4, air-cooled engine needed no water, no radiator, no complex cooling system. Its lightweight chassis, just 1,500 pounds without load, floated over soft terrain. Its narrow tires, mocked by the Allies, were designed to dig just enough to find grip without sinking. Every bolt, every weld, was a compromise between cost and function. It wasn't meant to overpower. It was meant to endure. Back in the desert, the Americans decided to have some fun. "Let's see what this toy can do," Reynolds said, climbing into the Kübelwagen's driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life, a weak cough compared to the Jeep's roar. He floored it, expecting a crawl. The Kübelwagen lurched forward, its rear-mounted engine whining as it climbed a shallow dune. The GIs laughed harder, shouting bets on how far it'd go before breaking down. Callahan jumped into his Jeep, revving the engine to show up the German contraption. The two vehicles raced toward a distant ridge, kicking up clouds of sand. The Jeep surged ahead, its 60 horsepower eating the distance. But the dune grew softer, the sand deeper. Callahan felt the wheels spin, then sink. The Jeep's heavy frame bogged down, its engine screaming as it overheated in the relentless sun. Reynolds, in the Kübelwagen, kept moving. Not fast, not flashy, but steady. The narrow tires found traction where the Jeep's wide ones floundered. The air-cooled engine didn't care about the 120-degree heat. By the time Reynolds reached the ridge, Callahan was stuck, cursing as his Jeep's radiator steamed. The laughter died. The GIs stared, jaws tight, as the Kübelwagen idled quietly on the crest. Becker, still bound, allowed himself a faint smile. They don't understand, he thought. This car isn't about power. It's about surviving. Across the desert, word of the incident spread. The bucket car had done the impossible. It had outrun a Jeep in the one place where power was supposed to win. Officers scribbled reports. Mechanics scratched their heads. The Kübelwagen, a vehicle built from scraps and ingenuity, was no longer just a joke. It was a mystery, one the Allies would soon scramble to unravel. In the days that followed, the captured Kübelwagen was shipped to a British base at Tobruk for testing. Engineers poked and prodded, skeptical but curious. They drove it through sand, over rocks, into heat that would kill any other engine. And it kept going. How? They wondered. What makes this thing tick? The answer lay not in what the Kübelwagen had, but in what it didn't. No radiator to boil, no heavy frame to sink, no complexity to break. It was a machine stripped to its soul, built not to impress, but to endure. And in the desert, endurance was everything. As the sun set over the dunes, casting long shadows across the sand, the Kübelwagen sat quietly, its silhouette small but defiant. The Americans had laughed at it, called it a toy, a bucket, a mistake. But now, as their Jeeps lay stranded in the heat, they began to wonder. Maybe this wasn't a joke. Maybe this was something else entirely. They laughed at it, until it started moving. The Libyan Desert, November 1942, was a graveyard of assumptions. The sun beat down with a vengeance, turning the sand into a shimmering sea that swallowed tracks as quickly as they were made. At a British forward base near Tobruk, the captured Kübelwagen sat under a canvas tarp, its boxy frame an object of curiosity and derision. The laughter from the American GIs and British Tommies hadn't fully faded, but it was tinged now with unease. Their Willys Jeeps, the darlings of Allied mobility, had faltered in the dunes, their radiators steaming, their heavy frames sinking. The bucket car, the German Type 82 Kübelwagen, had done what their machines could not. It had kept moving. The base buzzed with activity as engineers from the Royal Army Ordnance Corps prepared to put the strange vehicle through its paces. "Let's see if this tin can's a fluke," Major Harold Grayson, a grizzled British engineer, barked to his team. Grayson was a man of precision, his notebooks filled with diagrams of tank treads and truck axles. He'd seen the Jeep conquer muddy fields in England and rocky hills in Tunisia. To him, the Kübelwagen was an insult to engineering, a flimsy contraption that shouldn't survive a day in the desert. If it's so great, why does it look like it was built by a welder? He thought, adjusting his spectacles. Across the camp, Private Tommy Callahan and Sergeant Mike Reynolds, the Americans who'd raced the Kübelwagen and lost, watched from a distance. Callahan, still smarting from his Jeep's defeat, chewed on a cigarette. "Bet it falls apart the second they push it," he muttered. Reynolds, less certain, stayed quiet. That thing shouldn't have made it over the dune, he thought. But it did. The memory of the Kübelwagen gliding past his stranded Jeep gnawed at him, a splinter of doubt in his confidence. The tests began at dawn. Grayson's team had set up a course that mimicked the desert's worst. Soft dunes, rocky outcrops, and a bone-dry wadi littered with jagged stones. The Kübelwagen was pitted against a Willys Jeep and a British Bedford truck, the Allies' workhorses. The goal was simple: see which vehicle could handle the terrain, the heat, and the relentless punishment of the desert. Grayson's clipboard was ready, his pen poised to document the Kübelwagen's inevitable failure. First up was the Jeep, driven by a young corporal named Eddie Walsh, the Cockney who'd mocked the German vehicle days earlier. The Jeep roared to life, its 60-horsepower engine snarling as it tore into the course. It climbed the first dune with ease, its four-wheel drive gripping the sand. But as the terrain softened, the Jeep's wide tires began to spin, digging deeper with every revolution. Walsh gunned the engine, but the vehicle's 3,200-pound weight worked against it. Sand poured into the wheel wells, and the radiator began to hiss, steam curling into the air. By the time Walsh reached the wadi, the Jeep was struggling, its engine overheating in the 120-degree heat. He stopped, cursing, as mechanics rushed to check the damage. Next came the Bedford, a hulking truck designed for supply runs. It fared even worse. Its heavy frame sank into the dunes, and its water-cooled engine sputtered in the heat. The driver barely made it halfway before the truck bogged down, its wheels spinning uselessly. Grayson shook his head, scribbling notes. Typical, he thought. The desert doesn't care about size. Then it was the Kübelwagen's turn. Hans Becker, the captured Afrika Korps mechanic, was allowed to observe under guard, his expertise grudgingly requested by Grayson. Becker's hands were still bound, but his eyes were sharp, watching as a British driver climbed into the Kübelwagen. The engine coughed to life, its 24 horsepower sounding pathetic next to the Jeep's growl. The men smirked, expecting a quick failure. But the Kübelwagen moved with a quiet purpose, its narrow tires slicing through the sand where the Jeep had floundered. Its lightweight frame, barely 2,200 pounds fully loaded, seemed to float over the dunes, barely disturbing the surface. In the wadi, where rocks had battered the Jeep's undercarriage, the Kübelwagen's high ground clearance and simple suspension kept it steady. The air-cooled engine, free of a radiator's vulnerabilities, hummed along, unfazed by the heat. The driver pushed it harder, weaving through obstacles, climbing slopes that had stopped the Bedford cold. By the time the Kübelwagen completed the course, Grayson's clipboard was filled with notes, his skepticism giving way to a grudging curiosity. This shouldn't work, he thought. But it does. What's the trick? Grayson demanded, turning to Becker. The German mechanic shrugged, his English halting but clear. No trick. It is simple. Light. It does not fight the desert, it moves with it. Grayson snorted, but couldn't argue with the results. The Kübelwagen had outlasted both the Jeep and the Bedford, not through power, but through something else, something the Allies hadn't anticipated. The tests continued for days, each one revealing more about the vehicle's strange resilience. They loaded it with gear, far beyond its rated capacity, and it still climbed dunes. They drove it through heat that would boil a radiator dry, and the air-cooled engine kept running. They pushed it over rocks, through sandstorms, and into conditions that would cripple heavier machines. And still, it moved. Across the desert, in the ranks of the Afrika Korps, the Kübelwagen was proving its worth in ways the Allies couldn't yet imagine. Leutnant Fritz Krüger, a young officer serving under Erwin Rommel, relied on his Kübelwagen to navigate the shifting front lines. It's not a tank, he wrote in his journal, but it's the only thing that keeps up with the desert's demands. Krüger's unit was tasked with delivering messages between outposts, a job that required speed and reliability in terrain that broke heavier vehicles. The Kübelwagen darted through wadis, its narrow tires finding paths where tanks bogged down. It carried orders, supplies, and sometimes wounded men, its Spartan interior a mobile command post in the chaos of war. One afternoon, Krüger's Kübelwagen was caught in a sandstorm, visibility dropping to zero as wind howled across the dunes. A Panzer IV nearby ground to a halt, its tracks clogged with sand. But Krüger kept driving, the Kübelwagen's lightweight frame cutting through the storm like a knife. It's like it was born for this, he thought, gripping the wheel as the canvas roof flapped wildly. By the time the storm cleared, the Panzer was still stuck, but Krüger had delivered his orders, keeping Rommel's lines intact. Back at Tobruk, the Allied engineers began to unravel the Kübelwagen's secrets. Under the hood, they found an engine that was almost laughably small. A 1.1-liter flat-4, air-cooled, with a design so basic it bordered on crude. But its simplicity was its strength. No radiator meant no coolant to leak or boil. No complex systems meant fewer parts to break. The rear-mounted engine gave it surprising traction, the weight pressing down on the drive wheels. The chassis, stripped of excess, was a masterclass in minimalism. Ferdinand Porsche, you clever bastard, Grayson thought, sketching the engine's layout. You built a car that thrives on less. The tests weren't just about performance. The engineers tore the Kübelwagen apart, measuring every component, weighing every part. They found a vehicle designed not for glory, but for survival. The gearbox was robust, able to handle low-speed torque despite the engine's modest power. The suspension, though simple, absorbed shocks that would rattle a Jeep's frame. Even the narrow tires, mocked as inadequate, were a deliberate choice, designed to cut through soft terrain rather than plow through it. It's not trying to beat the desert, Grayson realized. It's working with it. The results sent ripples through the Allied command. Reports were dispatched to Cairo, then to London and Washington. The Kübelwagen wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a challenge to everything the Allies thought they knew about military vehicles. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where captured enemy equipment was studied, plans were made to ship another Kübelwagen for analysis. If the Germans can do this with so little, a U.S. colonel wrote, we need to know how. But the desert wasn't done teaching its lessons. During a reconnaissance mission near El Alamein, a British patrol in jeeps was ambushed by Afrika Korps scouts. The jeeps, loaded with supplies, struggled in the soft sand, their engines overheating as they tried to escape. A lone Kübelwagen, driven by a German sergeant, darted through the chaos, delivering coordinates to an artillery unit that turned the tide. The British retreated, their jeeps limping back to base. That damned bucket car, one officer muttered, his respect outweighing his frustration. For Hans Becker, still a prisoner, the tests were a vindication. He'd spent years keeping Kübelwagens running in the harshest conditions, patching tires under fire, coaxing engines back to life with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. They don't see it yet, he thought, watching Grayson's team scribble their notes. This car is us, it's Germany. We make do with what we have. The Kübelwagen wasn't a marvel of technology. It was a testament to necessity, a machine that turned scarcity into strength. As the sun set over Tobruk, the Kübelwagen sat quietly, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The Allies had come to the desert with power, with machines built to dominate. But the desert didn't care about horsepower. It cared about endurance, about ingenuity, about balance. And in that unforgiving arena, the bucket car was starting to look like something else entirely. A machine that could rewrite the rules of war. Maybe the joke was on us. The North African desert, late 1942, was a chessboard of fire and maneuver where every move was dictated by the unforgiving terrain. The Second Battle of El Alamein loomed, and the Afrika Korps, under General Erwin Rommel, danced a deadly ballet across the sands. Supply lines stretched thin, tanks broke down in the heat, and the desert devoured anything that dared to falter. Amid this chaos, the Kübelwagen, mocked by the Allies as a bucket car, emerged as an unlikely hero. It wasn't a tank, nor a truck, but a lifeline, threading through the dunes to keep Rommel's war machine alive. Leutnant Fritz Krüger gripped the wheel of his Kübelwagen, his eyes scanning the horizon for British patrols. The air was thick with dust, the sun a relentless hammer overhead. His Type 82, its desert yellow paint scarred by rocks and shrapnel, hummed steadily, its air-cooled engine unfazed by the 125-degree heat. Krüger's mission was simple but critical. Deliver orders from Rommel's headquarters to a panzer regiment 50 miles east, near the WWII Ridge. The route was treacherous, soft dunes, hidden wadys, and the constant threat of ambush. Tanks were too slow, trucks too heavy. The Kübelwagen was the only vehicle that could make the run. This car is my legs, Krüger thought, patting the dashboard. Without it, we're blind. The Afrika Korps relied on speed and surprise, Rommel's signature blitzkrieg tactics adapted to the desert's open expanse. But speed required mobility, and mobility required vehicles that could defy the sand's grip. The Kübelwagen, with its lightweight frame and narrow tires, was built for this. It didn't fight the desert, it flowed with it, gliding over dunes where heavier machines sank. At El Agheila, weeks earlier, Rommel had watched his panzers grind to a halt, their tracks clogged with sand. Supply trucks, overburdened and overheated, littered the landscape, their radiators boiling dry. But the Kübelwagens kept moving, darting between outposts, carrying messages, fuel, and even wounded men. Rommel, ever the pragmatist, saw their value immediately. The Kübel is our pulse, he told his staff, his voice sharp with conviction. It moves when nothing else can. He ordered every available Kübelwagen to the front, prioritizing them for reconnaissance, command transport, and emergency runs. The bucket car was no longer a joke, it was a tactical asset. Krüger's journey was a testament to that. His Kübelwagen wove through a maze of dunes, its 24-horsepower engine whining as it climbed slopes that would stall a panzer. The narrow tires, mocked by the Allies, found traction in the soft sand. cutting through where wide tires spun uselessly. The rear-mounted engine gave the vehicle surprising grip, its weight pressing down on the drive wheels. Krüger navigated by instinct, the desert's featureless expanse a map-only experience could read. If I stop, we lose the ridge, he thought, his knuckles white on the wheel. The orders in his satchel were Rommel's plan to outflank the British, a plan that hinged on speed. Halfway to the ridge, Krüger spotted trouble. A British reconnaissance patrol, 3 jeeps cresting a dune, their machine guns glinting in the sun. He swerved into a shallow wadi, the Kübelwagen's low profile vanishing into the terrain. The jeeps roared past, their heavy frames kicking up clouds of sand. Krüger waited, the engine idling with a soft hum, its air-cooled design immune to the heat that was already taxing the jeep's radiators. They're fast, he thought, but they won't last. Sure enough, one jeep slowed, steam rising from its hood. The Kübelwagen slipped away, unnoticed, its mission intact. Back at the Allied lines, the mood was shifting. The tests at Tobruk had left British and American engineers rattled. The Kübelwagen's performance wasn't a fluke, it was a revelation. Major Harold Grayson, the British engineer who'd overseen the trials, sent a report to Cairo. The German Type 82 outperforms our vehicles in soft terrain and extreme heat. Its simplicity is its strength. Recommend immediate analysis of captured units. The report landed on the desk of General Bernard Montgomery, who was preparing for El Alamein. Montgomery, a man who valued preparation over bravado, raised an eyebrow. If Rommel's relying on these things, we need to know why. The Kübelwagen's role in Rommel's strategy was becoming clear. During Operation Crusader, months earlier, the Afrika Korps had used Kübelwagens to outmaneuver Allied forces. While British Matildas and American Shermans bogged down in the sand, the Kübelwagens darted through gaps, delivering coordinates for artillery strikes. One German driver, Gefreiter Karl Weiss, earned a commendation for driving 200 miles through a sandstorm to warn a panzer unit of an impending British flank. His Kübelwagen, overloaded with fuel cans, had no right to survive the journey. But it did. It's not a car, Weiss later told his comrades, it's a mule. The Allies, meanwhile, were learning the hard way. During a push toward Gazala, a British convoy of jeeps and Bedford trucks stalled in a deep dune field. The sand was like quicksilver, swallowing tires and choking engines. A German scout in a Kübelwagen, spotting the stranded convoy, radioed its position. Enemy immobilized at grid 47, the scout reported, his voice crackling over the static. Within hours, Stuka dive bombers descended, turning the convoy into a smoldering wreck. The Kübelwagen was gone before the Allies could retaliate, its tracks already erased by the wind. Hans Becker, the captured Afrika Korps mechanic, heard about these incidents from his guards at Tobruk. Still a prisoner, he was occasionally consulted by Grayson's team, his knowledge of the Kübelwagen too valuable to ignore. They're starting to see it, Becker thought, watching the engineers pore over blueprints. They laughed, but now they're learning. He remembered nights in the desert, repairing Kübelwagens under starlight, their engines so simple he could fix them with a single wrench. Once he'd kept a unit running on scavenged oil and a jury-rigged fuel line, delivering a wounded officer to a field hospital. The Kübel doesn't care about glory, he thought, it just works. Rommel's reliance on the Kübelwagen wasn't just tactical, it was personal. In his command, Kübelwagen, he roamed the front lines, his driver navigating terrain that would trap heavier vehicles. The vehicle's Spartan interior suited him, its canvas roof shielding him from the sun but not the dust. Speed is everything, he told his driver, his eyes fixed on a map. This car gives us speed. During a retreat from Tobruk when fuel was scarce, Rommel's Kübelwagen ran on fumes, carrying him to safety while tanks ran dry. The men called it the Desert Fox's Chariot, half in jest, half in awe. The Kübelwagen's role extended beyond the battlefield. In remote outposts, it became a workhorse, hauling supplies, towing light guns, even serving as an ambulance. Its versatility was unmatched. A German medic, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, used a Kübelwagen to evacuate 6 wounded soldiers from a shelled position near Sidi Rezeg. The vehicle's frame groaned under the weight, but its engine never faltered. It's like it refuses to quit, Müller wrote in a letter home. Like us. The Allies couldn't ignore the evidence piling up. Captured Kübelwagens were appearing in their own ranks, pressed into service by British and American units desperate for reliable transport. A British officer near Benghazi was seen driving one, its German markings hastily painted over. "It's not pretty," he admitted to his men, "but it gets the job done." The irony wasn't lost on them. The toy car they'd mocked was now saving their missions. At Tobruk, Grayson's team continued their analysis, their initial skepticism replaced by a grudging respect. They sent samples of the Kübelwagen's components, tires, engine parts, suspension springs, to labs in England. Ferdinand Porsche knew what he was doing, Grayson admitted to himself, sketching the vehicle's torque curve. The Kübelwagen's 24 horsepower was laughable, but its efficiency was uncanny, delivering just enough power to keep moving where others stalled. It's not about brute force, he realized. It's about balance. As El Alamein approached, the Kübelwagen's role in Rommel's strategy became a quiet legend. It wasn't the Panzers or the Luftwaffe that kept the Afrika Korps alive. It was the humble Type 82, threading through the desert like a needle, stitching together a campaign that defied the odds. The Allies, preparing their own offensive, began to wonder what else they'd underestimated. The desert, it seemed, had its own rules, and the Kübelwagen was playing by them. The desert belonged to those who didn't fight it. The Eastern Front, winter 1942-43, was a world away from the scorching sands of North Africa. Here, the Russian steppes stretched endless under a sky heavy with snow, the air so cold it burned the lungs. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, turning oil to sludge and metal to brittle glass. The Wehrmacht, battered by Soviet counteroffensives, clung to fragile supply lines along the Don River. Tanks froze in their tracks, trucks refused to start, and men shivered in trenches, their breath clouding in the icy dawn. In this frozen hell, the Kübelwagen, the bucket car mocked by the Allies in the desert, faced a new test, and emerged as a lifeline where power alone failed. Obergefreiter Karl Weiss gripped the steering wheel of his Type 82 Kübelwagen, his gloved fingers numb despite the layers of wool. The engine's faint hum was a whisper against the howling wind, its air-cooled design untouched by the cold that crippled other vehicles. Weiss's mission was desperate: deliver medical supplies to a field hospital near Stalingrad, 80 miles through snowdrifts and mud. The roads were gone, buried under ice, and Soviet snipers lurked in the hills. "If I stop, men die," Weiss thought, his eyes fixed on the white void ahead. The Kübelwagen, its canvas roof tattered and its frame rattling, was his only hope. In the desert, the Kübelwagen had been a curiosity, a lightweight oddity that defied the sand. Here, in the Russian winter, it was a miracle. Its 24-horsepower engine, so underpowered compared to the Allies' 60-horsepower Jeeps, needed no antifreeze, no radiator to freeze solid. Its 2,200-pound frame glided over snow where heavier vehicles sank. The narrow tires, once laughed at by American GIs, cut through drifts like blades, finding grip in the frozen muck. This car was built for this, Weiss thought, coaxing it through a snowbank. It doesn't care about the cold. The Eastern Front was a graveyard for machines. German Panzer IIIs and IVs, the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored might, stalled as their engines seized in the sub-zero temperatures. Soviet T-34s, though more robust, struggled with fuel lines that froze overnight. American-supplied Jeeps, sent to the Red Army via Lend-Lease, fared no better. Their water-cooled engines demanded constant maintenance, their radiators cracking under the strain. "The Jeep is a beast," a Soviet driver grumbled, kicking a frozen tire, "but it's no match for this winter." The Kübelwagen, by contrast, started every morning, its air-cooled engine purring as if the cold were a mere inconvenience. Leutnant Fritz Krüger, now reassigned from the Afrika Korps to the Eastern Front, saw the Kübelwagen's value firsthand. His unit, part of the 6th Army, was tasked with holding a defensive line near Voronezh. Supplies were scarce, and the roads were impassable. Choked with snow and mud, Krüger's Kübelwagen became the unit's lifeline, ferrying ammunition, food, and orders between outposts. "It's not fast," he told his men, his breath fogging in the air, "but it's the only thing that moves." Once, during a Soviet artillery barrage, Krüger drove through a blizzard to evacuate a wounded officer. The Kübelwagen's narrow tires carving a path through drifts that trapped heavier trucks. "It's like it refuses to give up," he thought. The engine's steady hum, a faint pulse of hope, The Kübelwagen's simplicity was its strength. Ferdinand Porsche's design, born from the Volkswagen Beetle, had stripped away everything unnecessary. No radiator meant no coolant to freeze. The flat-4 engine, cooled by air alone, was so basic it could be repaired with minimal tools. Hans Becker, the Afrika Korps mechanic, now a prisoner in Allied hands, had known this in the desert. On the Eastern Front, mechanics like Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt echoed his experience. Schmidt, stationed near Kharkov, kept a fleet of Kübelwagens running with little more than a wrench and a can of scavenged oil. "The engine's a toy," he told a skeptical officer, "but it's a toy that works." When a Kübelwagen's gearbox seized in the cold, Schmidt rebuilt it in a tent under lamplight, while Soviet shells fell nearby. The Allies, meanwhile, were learning the same lesson. In Murmansk, where Lend-Lease convoys delivered jeeps and trucks to the Red Army, the winter exposed their limits. A Soviet officer, Colonel Ivan Petrov, filed a report. "American vehicles are powerful but fragile in extreme cold. Radiators burst, batteries die. The German Kübelwagen, captured from retreating units, starts every time." Petrov's men began using captured Kübelwagens for scouting missions, their German markings painted over with red stars. "It's ugly," one driver admitted, "but it's alive." The Kübelwagen's role grew beyond utility. In the chaos of Stalingrad, it became a symbol of endurance. During the encirclement of the Sixth Army, when supply lines collapsed, Kübelwagens were often the only vehicles still moving. They carried wounded men to makeshift hospitals, their Spartan interiors stained with blood and frost. One driver, Gefreiter Hans Miller, drove through a Soviet ambush to deliver insulin to a dying officer. The Kübelwagen's windshield was shattered, its frame peppered with bullet holes, but it reached the hospital. "This car is our soul," Miller told his comrades, his voice hoarse. "It carries us when we can't carry ourselves." Back in North Africa, the Kübelwagen's reputation was spreading. At Tobruk, British engineers continued their tests, their findings now shared with American teams at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Major Harold Grayson, the British engineer who'd once scoffed at the bucket car, was now a convert. "It's not just the engine," he wrote in his log. "It's the whole philosophy, light, simple, adaptable." The Kübelwagen's design was a rebuke to the Allied obsession with power. Its torque, though modest, was delivered with precision, allowing it to crawl through terrain that stopped jeeps and Bedfords. Its high ground clearance and lightweight chassis made it nimble where others were clumsy. On the Eastern Front, the Kübelwagen's legend grew during the retreat from Stalingrad. As the Sixth Army crumbled, Kübelwagens became lifelines, carrying commanders through snowstorms to rally scattered units. One officer, Mayor Klaus Ritter, owed his life to a Kübelwagen that pulled him from a burning outpost. The vehicle, driven by a young corporal, navigated a frozen riverbed under machine gun fire, its engine never faltering. "It's not a car," Ritter wrote in his report. "It's a miracle." The Allies couldn't ignore the evidence. Captured Kübelwagens were now in use across the front, from Soviet scouts in the Ukraine to British commandos in Tunisia. The U.S. officer in Cairo reviewing Grayson's reports scribbled a note, "If we'd built this, we'd call it genius." The irony was bitter. The vehicle they'd mocked was now saving their men. At Aberdeen, engineers began dissecting a Kübelwagen, measuring its components with a mix of awe and frustration. "Porsche didn't just build a car," one technician muttered. "He built an answer." For the Germans, the Kübelwagen was more than a machine. It was a reflection of their struggle. "We have so little," Weiss thought, "driving through the snow, but we make it enough." The Kübelwagen embodied that ethos, its simplicity a defiance of the odds. It wasn't invincible, but it was relentless, a stubborn refusal to break in a war that broke everything. As the Russian winter deepened, the Kübelwagen rolled on, its tracks faint in the snow but its impact undeniable. The Allies, watching from their frozen camps, began to see the truth. Power could conquer hills, but only endurance could conquer the cold. And in that frozen crucible, the bucket car was rewriting the rules. No radiator, no failure, no stopping. Spring 1943 marked a turning point in the war, as the tides of battle shifted against the Axis. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps faced mounting pressure from Montgomery's Eighth Army and the advancing American forces. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht reeled from the catastrophe at Stalingrad, their supply lines fraying like worn thread. Yet, amidst the chaos, the Kübelwagen, the German bucket car once mocked as a toy, continued to defy expectations. Its air-cooled engine hummed through sand and snow, its lightweight frame threading through terrain that halted heavier machines. The Allies, who had laughed at its boxy silhouette, were now forced to confront its brilliance, not on the battlefield, but in their own testing grounds, where captured Kübelwagens revealed a design philosophy that challenged their assumptions. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a captured Type 82 Kübelwagen sat in a hangar, its desert yellow paint faded but intact. American engineers, led by Captain Robert Ellison, a meticulous mechanical engineer from Detroit, surrounded the vehicle, their tools clattering as they disassembled it. Ellison had spent years testing tanks and jeeps, machines that embodied American industrial might. The Kübelwagen, with its 24-horsepower engine and Spartan design, seemed like a relic from a bygone era. "This thing looks like it was built in a shed," he thought, running his hand over the flat steel panels. "How does it keep going where our jeeps fail?" The tests at Aberdeen were exhaustive. The Kübelwagen was driven through mud, sand, and gravel, its performance compared to the Willys Jeep, the pride of the U.S. Army. The Jeep's 60-horsepower engine roared with authority, its four-wheel drive climbing hills with ease. But in soft terrain, its 3,200-pound frame sank, its radiator overheating under strain. The Kübelwagen, by contrast, glided forward, its 2,200-pound weight and narrow tires finding traction where the Jeep spun uselessly. "It's not power," Ellison noted in his log, "it's efficiency." The Kübelwagen's torque, though modest, was delivered with precision, its rear-mounted engine pressing weight onto the drive wheels for surprising grip. In North Africa, British engineers at Tobruk continued their own analysis, building on Major Harold Grayson's earlier tests. Grayson, once skeptical, now approached the Kübelwagen with a convert's zeal. He'd sent samples of its components, tires, suspension springs, gearbox, to labs in London, along with detailed reports. "The Type 82's simplicity is deceptive," he wrote. "Every part is designed for function, not flash." The air-cooled engine, free of a radiator's vulnerabilities, ran flawlessly in the desert's heat. The chassis, stripped of excess, absorbed shocks that rattled heavier vehicles. Even the canvas roof, mocked as flimsy, was a deliberate choice, light, replaceable, and immune to rust. The Kübelwagen's designer, Ferdinand Porsche, loomed large in these discoveries. Porsche, a visionary who'd crafted race cars and tanks, had taken the civilian Volkswagen Beetle and distilled it into a military workhorse. His philosophy was stark: eliminate complexity, prioritize reliability. The Kübelwagen's flat-four engine was a marvel of minimalism, with fewer moving parts than a Jeep's power plant. Its gearbox, though basic, handled low-speed torque with ease, allowing the vehicle to crawl through terrain that stopped others cold. Porsche didn't build a car, Grayson told his team. He built a solution. The Allies' grudging admiration grew through field reports. In Tunisia, during the push toward Tunis, a British commando unit used a captured Kübelwagen to navigate a rocky wadi, its lightweight frame weaving through terrain that stalled their jeeps. "It's not pretty," the unit's captain reported, "but it's the only thing that got us through." In the Soviet Union, Red Army scouts near Kursk relied on captured Kübelwagens to scout German positions. Their air-cooled engines starting in temperatures that froze Lend-Lease jeeps solid. A Soviet officer, Lieutenant Alexei Volkov, noted, "The German car is weak, but it's stubborn. It doesn't quit." These stories reached Hans Becker, the Afrika Korps mechanic still held as a prisoner at Tobruk. Becker, whose expertise had been tapped by Grayson's team, listened quietly as guards recounted tales of Kübelwagens in Allied hands. "They're learning," he thought, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He'd spent years keeping Kübelwagens running in the desert, patching tires under fire, rebuilding engines with scavenged parts. Once, near El Alamein, he'd kept a Kübelwagen moving on a cracked fuel line, delivering a wounded officer to safety. "It's not about strength," he'd told his crew. "It's about endurance." The Kübelwagen's impact wasn't limited to the front lines. At Aberdeen, Ellison's team uncovered details that deepened their respect. The vehicle's fuel efficiency was remarkable, squeezing miles out of gallons that left jeeps thirsty. Its maintenance was a mechanic's dream, simple enough that a single soldier could repair it in the field. "You don't need a factory to keep this thing running," Ellison told his team, holding up a stripped-down carburetor. You need a wrench and a brain. The Kübelwagen's design was a rebuke to the Allies' reliance on complexity, a reminder that sometimes less was more. In London, British engineers at the War Office pored over Grayson's reports, their findings echoed by captured German documents. One memo from a Wehrmacht officer in the Afrika Korps described the Kübelwagen as the backbone of our mobility. It detailed missions where Kübelwagens towed anti-tank guns, carried radio equipment, and even served as makeshift ambulances. Its strength is its simplicity, the officer wrote. It does what it must, no more, no less. The British, accustomed to their heavy Bedfords, began to wonder if they'd overlooked something vital. The Kübelwagen's influence was spreading beyond analysis. In North Africa, Allied units began integrating captured Kübelwagens into their operations, their German markings painted over with Allied stars. The U.S. reconnaissance team near Kasserine Pass used one to scout German positions, its low profile slipping through ravines undetected. I'd take a jeep for a sprint, the team's sergeant said, but for the long haul, give me the bucket car. The irony was thick. The vehicle they'd mocked was now saving their missions. On the Eastern Front, the Kübelwagen's legend grew. During a retreat near Rostov, a German unit used Kübelwagens to evacuate wounded men through a snowstorm, their engines humming where trucks and tanks failed. The vehicle's lightweight frames navigated frozen rivers, their narrow tires finding grip on ice. A German medic, Obergefreiter Hans Miller, wrote in his diary, "The Kübelwagen is our guardian. It carries us through hell." The Allies, capturing these vehicles in increasing numbers, began to see them not as trophies but as tools. At Aberdeen, Ellison's team reached a conclusion that echoed Grayson's findings. The Kübelwagen's brilliance lay in its purpose. It wasn't designed to outmuscle or outshine, it was designed to survive. Its torque curve, meticulously charted, showed a vehicle optimized for low-speed traction, perfect for the mud of Russia or the sand of Libya. Its air-cooled engine, free of a radiator's fragility, was a masterstroke in hostile environments. Porsche saw the war's demands, Ellison thought, and answered with elegance. The Allies' respect was reluctant but undeniable. Reports from Tobruk, Aberdeen, and the front lines painted a picture of a vehicle that defied logic, a machine that thrived on constraint. The Kübelwagen wasn't a marvel of power, it was a marvel of intent, a testament to what could be achieved when every ounce of excess was stripped away. As the war ground on, the Allies began to look at their own designs with new eyes, wondering if they'd been chasing the wrong ideals. In the desert and the snow, the Kübelwagen rolled on, its tracks faint but its impact profound. The Allies, once so quick to laugh, now studied it with a mix of awe and envy. The bucket car had forced them to rethink their machines, their strategies, and their assumptions. It wasn't a car that won battles, it was a car that refused to lose them. It wasn't power, it was purpose. Spring 1944 was a season of unraveling for the Third Reich. In the east, the Red Army surged forward, reclaiming ground lost in the early years of Barbarossa. In the west, the Allies prepared for D-Day, their invasion plans a tightening noose around Hitler's empire. The Wehrmacht, stretched to breaking, fought on borrowed time, its supply lines crumbling under the weight of relentless offensives. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer, and morale hung by a thread. Yet in this chaos, the Kübelwagen, the Type 82 bucket car, once mocked by Allied troops, remained a stubborn constant, a lifeline for soldiers and commanders clinging to the fraying edges of the war. Its air-cooled engine hummed through mud and ruin, its lightweight frame carrying men and hope where heavier machines faltered. On the Eastern Front, near the Dnieper River, Obergefreiter Karl Weiss drove his Kübelwagen through a landscape of devastation. The roads were churned to mud by retreating tanks, the air thick with the smoke of burning villages. Weiss's mission was grim: evacuate wounded soldiers from a collapsing outpost before Soviet forces overran it. His vehicle, its canvas roof torn and its frame dented by shrapnel, groaned under the weight of 6 men, twice its intended capacity. This car wasn't built for this, Weiss thought, his hands tight on the wheel, but it's all we've got. The Kübelwagen's 24-horsepower engine strained, but its air-cooled design kept it running, immune to the muddy slush that clogged radiators. Its narrow tires found grip where tanks spun uselessly, navigating a path through the mire. "Hold on, boys," Weiss muttered, his voice barely audible over the engine's whine. The wounded men in the back groaned, their bandages soaked with blood and mud. A Soviet artillery shell landed nearby, shaking the ground, but the Kübelwagen pressed on, its lightweight frame weaving between craters. Weiss had driven this vehicle for 2 years, from the deserts of Libya to the frozen steppes of Russia. He knew its limits, its quirks, the way its gearbox growled when pushed too hard. "It's not a machine," he thought, glancing at the dashboard. "It's a partner." The Kübelwagen reached the field hospital, just as Soviet tanks crested the horizon, its engine still humming as medics rushed to unload the men. The Kübelwagen's role in these final months was not one of glory, but of grit. In the retreat from Kursk, it became the Wehrmacht's lifeline, carrying orders, supplies, and wounded through terrain that broke heavier vehicles. Leutnant Fritz Krüger, now a battle-hardened officer, relied on his Kübelwagen to maintain contact between scattered units. "The panzers are gone, the trucks are stuck," he wrote in his journal, "but the Kübel keeps us tethered." During a desperate stand near Kiev, Krüger's Kübelwagen darted through a hail of machine gun fire to deliver ammunition to a pinned-down infantry unit. The vehicle's low profile and nimble handling saved the day, its tracks barely visible in the churned mud. "It's not fast," Krüger thought, "but it's fearless." For the men who drove them, the Kübelwagen became more than a tool. It was a bond. Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt, a mechanic in the 9th Army, had kept his unit's Kübelwagens running through 3 winters. In a muddy camp near Minsk, he worked by lantern light, patching a fuel line with wire and tape. "This car is like us," he told a young driver, his hands black with oil. "It's tired, it's battered, but it doesn't quit." Schmidt had seen Kübelwagens tow anti-tank guns, carry radio equipment, and even serve as makeshift hearses, their interiors stained with the war's toll. Once, he'd driven a Kübelwagen 100 miles on a single tank of fuel, its engine sipping what little gas remained. "It's not about power," he thought. "It's about will." The Allies, too, were forging their own bonds with the Kübelwagen. Captured vehicles, now painted with Allied stars, were ubiquitous across the fronts. In Normandy, a British commando unit used a Kübelwagen to scout German defenses, its quiet engine slipping through hedgerows undetected. "It's a German car, but it's ours now," the unit's sergeant said, patting its hood. In Italy, American GIs near Monte Cassino pressed a Kübelwagen into service as an ambulance, its lightweight frame navigating mountain paths that stalled their jeeps. "I'd rather have a jeep for a drag race," one driver joked, "but for this, the bucket car's king." At Aberdeen Proving Ground, Captain Robert Ellison's team continued their analysis, their respect for the Kübelwagen deepening with every test. They disassembled its engine, measured its torque, and marveled at its simplicity. "Porsche didn't just build a car," Ellison told his team, holding up a stripped-down piston. "He built a philosophy." The Kübelwagen's design was a masterclass in minimalism. Every part served a purpose, every ounce justified. Its air-cooled engine, free of a radiator's fragility, ran in conditions that killed Allied vehicles. Its gearbox, though basic, delivered torque with surgical precision, allowing the vehicle to crawl through mud or snow. "It's not trying to win a race," Ellison realized, "it's trying to survive." In North Africa, the Kübelwagen's legacy lingered. Hans Becker, the Afrika Korps mechanic still held at Tobruk, heard stories of Allied units using his former vehicles. "They mocked it once," he thought, a faint smile crossing his face. "Now they fight over it." Becker had kept Kübelwagens running through sandstorms and shellfire, his hands scarred from years of wrenching in the desert. He remembered a night near El Alamein when his Kübelwagen carried a dying officer to safety, its engine coughing but never stopping. "It's not a hero," he'd told his crew, "it's just stubborn." The Kübelwagen's stubbornness was its legacy. In the final months of the war, as the Reich collapsed, it became a symbol of endurance. In Poland, a German unit used Kübelwagens to evacuate civilians from a burning village, their engines running on fumes as Soviet tanks closed in. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, Kübelwagens darted through snow-covered forests carrying orders for a desperate counteroffensive. One driver, Gefreiter Hans Miller, drove through a blizzard to deliver a message that saved a stranded company. "This car is our last hope," he told his commander, his hands trembling from cold. "It's all we have left." The emotional bonds ran deep. Drivers named their Kübelwagens Greta, Liesel, Fritz, as if they were comrades. Mechanics like Schmidt treated them like family, knowing every rattle, every quirk. In a war that stripped men of humanity, the Kübelwagen offered a strange comfort, a machine that refused to abandon them. "It's not much," a driver near Berlin told his squad, "but it's ours." As the Reich's cities burned, the Kübelwagen carried men through the ashes, its tracks a faint testament to resilience. The Allies, watching from their advancing lines, saw the Kübelwagen's impact. Reports from captured German soldiers described its role in keeping units cohesive, even in retreat. A Soviet officer, interrogating a Wehrmacht prisoner, noted, "They speak of the Kübelwagen like it's alive." The Allies' own use of captured Kübelwagens grew, their reliability a quiet admission of German ingenuity. At Tobruk, Major Harold Grayson's final report to London was blunt. "The Type 82 is a lesson in design. We underestimated it, and we paid for it." As the war's end loomed, the Kübelwagen stood as a paradox, a machine born of scarcity that outlasted the Reich's ambitions. Its drivers and mechanics, men like Weiss, Krüger, and Schmidt, saw it not as a weapon, but as a survivor, a reflection of their own defiance. In the mud of Poland, the snow of Russia, and the ruins of Germany, it kept moving, carrying the weight of a dying war on its narrow tires. Even as the Reich burned, the Kübel kept moving. The spring of 1945 brought silence to a war-torn world. The Third Reich had collapsed, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies scattered or surrendered. The roar of tanks and the scream of artillery faded, leaving only the echoes of a conflict that had reshaped nations. Amid the wreckage, the Kübelwagen, the Type 82 bucket car, once ridiculed by Allied troops, stood as an unlikely survivor. Its boxy frame and air-cooled engine, mocked as underpowered in the deserts of North Africa and the snows of Russia, had outlasted the regime it served. Now, in the hands of Allied engineers, the Kübelwagen faced its final test. Not in battle, but in the laboratories and proving grounds where the victors dissected the tools of their fallen enemy. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a captured Kübelwagen sat under fluorescent lights, its desert yellow paint chipped but defiant. Captain Robert Ellison, the American engineer who'd spent months testing the vehicle, walked around it one last time. His team had torn it apart, measured every bolt, and driven it through conditions that broke lesser machines. "This thing shouldn't work," Ellison muttered, his fingers tracing the edge of a fender. "But it does." The Kübelwagen's 24-horsepower engine, a fraction of the Jeep's 60, had proven its worth in torque efficiency and reliability. Its 2,200-pound frame, half the weight of a Willys, floated over terrain that sank heavier vehicles. Its air-cooled design, free of a radiator's fragility, laughed at the heat and cold that crippled Allied engines. The final tests at Aberdeen were a revelation. The Kübelwagen was driven through mud, sand, and gravel, its performance charted against the Jeep and other Allied vehicles. In soft terrain, its narrow tires outperformed the Jeep's wider ones, cutting through rather than plowing under. Its gearbox, though simple, delivered power with a precision that belied its modest output. "It's not about horsepower," Ellison wrote in his report. "It's about balance." The Kübelwagen's fuel efficiency was staggering, squeezing miles from gallons that left Jeeps stranded. Its maintenance was a mechanic's dream. Most repairs could be done with a wrench and a spare hour. Porsche built a machine that thrives on less, Ellison thought, shaking his head. In England, at the Royal Army Ordnance Corps' testing facility in Chertsey, Major Harold Grayson reached similar conclusions. Grayson, who'd first encountered the Kübelwagen at Tobruk, had sent reams of data to London, detailing its performance in the desert. Now, with the war over, he oversaw tests that pushed the vehicle to its limits. They loaded it beyond capacity, drove it through flooded streams, and ran it on low-grade fuel scavenged from captured German stockpiles. The Kübelwagen endured, its engine humming where others stalled. Ferdinand Porsche didn't just design a car, Grayson told his team, holding up a blueprint. He designed a philosophy, simplicity as strength. The Kübelwagen's brilliance was no longer a secret. Captured vehicles pressed into service by Allied units during the war now filled engineering labs across the United States and Britain. At Chertsey, British engineers marveled at the vehicle's suspension, a simple torsion bar system that absorbed shocks better than expected. The chassis, stripped of excess, was a lesson in minimalism, every weld serving a purpose. "We built for power," a British technician noted, comparing it to the Bedford truck. "They built for survival." Reports from Chertsey and Aberdeen were shared with civilian manufacturers, who began to see the Kübelwagen not as a relic of war, but as a blueprint for the future. The Kübelwagen's legacy was rooted in its origins. Ferdinand Porsche, tasked in 1938 with creating a military vehicle from the Volkswagen Beetle, had faced constraints that would have broken lesser designers. Germany's economy was stretched thin, its factories prioritizing tanks and planes. Porsche's solution was ruthless efficiency, an air-cooled engine with minimal parts, a lightweight frame that sacrificed armor for mobility, and a design that could be mass-produced on a shoestring. The result was a vehicle that defied expectations, not through brute force, but through ingenuity. "He turned scarcity into a weapon," Grayson wrote, his respect evident in every line. Across the Atlantic, American engineers saw parallels to their own wartime innovations. The Jeep, for all its power, was a product of abundance. Detroit's factories could afford to build complex, robust machines. The Kübelwagen, born of necessity, was a different beast. "If we'd been as desperate as the Germans," Ellison told a colleague, "we might have built something like this." The irony was inescapable. The Allies' industrial might had won the war, but the Kübelwagen's frugality had kept the Wehrmacht mobile far longer than it should have. Field reports from the war's final months underscored this. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, Kübelwagens had darted through snow-covered forests carrying orders for Germany's last major offensive. In Poland, they'd evacuated civilians from advancing Soviet lines, their engines running on fumes. Hans Becker, the Afrika Korps mechanic who'd been a prisoner since 1942, had heard these stories from Allied guards. Released after the war, he returned to Germany, where he found a Kübelwagen in a wrecked motor pool. They laughed at it, he thought, touching its battered hood, but it outlived them all. The Kübelwagen's influence began to seep into post-war design. In Wolfsburg, the Volkswagen factory, spared from total destruction, prepared to resurrect the Beetle, a civilian cousin of the Kübelwagen. British and American engineers, tasked with rebuilding Germany's industry, studied the Type 82's design, noting its potential for civilian vehicles. Its air-cooled engine and lightweight chassis inspired early concepts for off-road vehicles, planting seeds that would later bloom in models like the Land Rover and the Jeep's civilian successors. The Germans were onto something, a British officer wrote in a 1946 report. "Simplicity isn't weakness, it's adaptability." The Kübelwagen's drivers and mechanics, men like Leutnant Fritz Krüger and Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt, saw it as more than a machine. Krüger, who survived the war, spoke of his Kübelwagen as a comrade, a vehicle that carried him through the deserts of Libya and the snows of Russia. "It was never about speed," he told a journalist in 1946. "It was about trust." Schmidt, now a civilian mechanic, kept a photo of his wartime Kübelwagen, its frame dented but unbroken. "It was us," he said, pointing to the image, beaten, tired, but still moving. The Allies' final verdict was clear. At Aberdeen, Ellison's report concluded, "The Type 82 is a triumph of engineering under constraint. Its lessons should inform our future designs." At Chertsey, Grayson's team echoed the sentiment, recommending that British manufacturers study the Kübelwagen's principles. The bucket car, once a punchline, had earned a place in the annals of engineering. Its legacy wasn't in its power, but in its persistence, a reminder that genius often hides in the ordinary. As the world rebuilt, the Kübelwagen's story lingered in the minds of those who'd seen it in action. It wasn't a hero's chariot or a conqueror's steed. It was a survivor, a machine that turned limitation into strength. The Allies, who'd once laughed at its boxy frame, now studied it with reverence, their notebooks filled with lessons from a car that refused to break. Maybe simplicity had been genius all along. The summer of 1945 was a time of rebirth. As the world emerged from the shadow of war, Europe lay in ruins, its cities scarred, its people weary but hopeful. The Third Reich was gone, its ambitions reduced to ash, but one of its creations endured, not as a weapon but as a symbol of ingenuity. The Kübelwagen, the Type 82 bucket car that had once drawn laughter from Allied troops, stood as a quiet testament to the power of simplicity. Its boxy frame and air-cooled engine, mocked in the deserts of North Africa and the snows of Russia, had outlasted the regime it served. Now, in the post-war world, its legacy was taking root, not in battlefields but in factories, design labs, and the minds of engineers who saw in it a blueprint for the future. In Wolfsburg, Germany, the Volkswagen factory stood battered but intact, spared from total destruction by Allied forces. Under British supervision, the plant began to rebuild, its focus shifting from military production to civilian vehicles. The Volkswagen Beetle, the Kübelwagen's civilian ancestor, was poised for a renaissance. The Type 82's DNA, its air-cooled engine, lightweight chassis, and minimalist design, lived on in the Beetle, a car that would soon become a global icon. The Kübelwagen showed us what was possible. A Volkswagen engineer named Heinrich Miller said in 1946, inspecting a prototype Beetle, "Build for the people, not for glory." The Beetle's simplicity, born of the same constraints that shaped the Kübelwagen, would make it a symbol of post-war resilience, a car for a world rebuilding from scratch. Across the Atlantic, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Captain Robert Ellison closed his final report on the Kübelwagen. His team had spent months dissecting the vehicle, marveling at its efficiency. The Type 82's 24-horsepower engine, a fraction of the Jeep's power, had proven its worth in torque and reliability. Its 2,200-pound frame floated over terrain that sank heavier machines. Ferdinand Porsche didn't just build a car, Ellison wrote, he built a lesson in restraint. The Kübelwagen's influence was already seeping into American design. Engineers at WWII, the Jeep's manufacturer, studied captured Kübelwagens, noting their fuel efficiency and low maintenance. Early concepts for civilian Jeeps, which would debut in 1945, borrowed ideas from the Type 82's lightweight chassis and versatile handling. "We laughed at it," Ellison told a colleague, "but it's teaching us how to build better." In Britain, Major Harold Grayson's work at Chertsey had a similar impact. His reports on the Kübelwagen, filled with diagrams and test data, reached the desks of civilian manufacturers like Rover. The Kübelwagen's torsion bar suspension and high ground clearance inspired early designs for the Land Rover, a vehicle that would become synonymous with off-road capability. "The Germans showed us that less can be more," Grayson wrote in a 1947 memo. The Type 82's simplicity is its genius. The Land Rover, launched in 1948, owed a quiet debt to the Kübelwagen, its rugged versatility a nod to the bucket car that had defied the desert and the snow. The Kübelwagen's legacy was personal as well as technical. Hans Becker, the Afrika Korps mechanic who'd kept Kübelwagens running through sandstorms, returned to civilian life in Germany. In 1946, he found work at a Volkswagen repair shop, his hands once again coaxing air-cooled engines to life. "The Kübelwagen was my war," he told a friend, his voice soft but firm. "It carried us when nothing else could." Becker's stories of driving through shellfire, patching tires under starlight, and saving lives with a machine others mocked became part of the Volkswagen mythos, a reminder that ingenuity could triumph over adversity. Leutnant Fritz Krüger, who'd driven Kübelwagens from Libya to Russia, survived the war and settled in Hamburg. He kept a photo of his Type 82, its canvas roof tattered, its frame scarred. "It wasn't a hero," he told a journalist in 1949, "but it was loyal." Krüger's Kübelwagen had carried him through ambushes, blizzards, and retreats, its engine a steady pulse in the chaos of war. For him, it was more than a vehicle, it was a companion, a symbol of endurance in a world that demanded it. Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt, the mechanic who'd kept Kübelwagens running on the Eastern Front, found himself in Wolfsburg, working alongside Miller at the Volkswagen factory. "The Kübel taught me everything," Schmidt said. "Assembling a Beetle's engine. Make it simple. Make it last." His wartime memories of repairing gearboxes in the snow, of driving through mud to deliver supplies, shaped his approach to the Beetle, a car that carried the Kübelwagen's spirit into the civilian world. The Beetle's success, with millions sold over decades, was a testament to the principles Porsche had embedded in the Type 82: efficiency, reliability, and adaptability. The Kübelwagen's influence extended beyond Volkswagen. In the United States, off-road enthusiasts and engineers began experimenting with lightweight vehicles, inspired by reports of the Type 82's performance. The dune buggy, a cultural icon of the 1960s, owed a debt to the Kübelwagen's air-cooled engine and minimalist frame. In Europe, small utility vehicles like the Fiat Panda and Citroën Mehari echoed the Kübelwagen's ethos, prioritizing function over flash. The Germans showed us how to build for the real world, a French designer noted in 1950, sketching a prototype, not for showrooms, but for survival. The Kübelwagen's story was not without irony. The Allies, who'd once laughed at its boxy shape and weak engine, had adopted it during the war, painting over its swastikas to use it against its creators. Now in peacetime, they studied it, copied it, and learned from it. The Jeep remained a symbol of American power, but the Kübelwagen was a lesson in humility, a reminder that strength could hide in the unassuming. "We chased horsepower," Grayson wrote in his final report, while the Germans mastered balance. For the men who'd driven it, the Kübelwagen was more than a machine. It was a mirror of their own struggles. Becker, Krüger, and Schmidt saw in it their own resilience, their ability to make do with less in a war that demanded everything. The Kübelwagen had carried them through fire, sand, and snow, its tracks faint but indelible. Its legacy was not in conquest, but in endurance, a quiet defiance of the odds. As the Beetle rolled off Wolfsburg's assembly lines, it carried the Kübelwagen's spirit into a new era. The world embraced it, not as a war machine, but as a symbol of possibility, a car for the everyman, born from the same ingenuity that had kept the Type 82 moving through hell. The Kübelwagen, once a joke, had become a cornerstone, its lessons shaping the vehicles that would define the post-war world. They laughed at it until they copied it. If you love stories where innovation hides behind humility, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history.